Hi, I'm Jay Marshall, and I want to talk to you about Edward Bellamy from Chicopee Falls, who was born in 1850. He worked as a journalist and even founded a paper in our local area, which continues today after mergers and acquisitions as the Springfield Republican, our last major regional print daily. He was a small town or small village person who was used to a more peaceful and natural environment. He did not appreciate the chaos and disorder, yet he was to bear witness to the dramatic industrialization of the American economy. The US was about to become the most powerful economy in the world. He saw his bucolic Chicopee area experience rapid industrialization, such that he eventually became the sixth largest city in Massachusetts. A trip to Germany exposed him to urban poverty, and he believed it was caused by their powerful industrial cartels. He was worried he was being transplanted to the United States as industrialization grew. And given the rapid expansion of industry that we learned about in Midwestern industrialization and the American manufacturing belt in the 19th century, it's understandable where he might have gotten that idea. Having previously written science fiction novels, this experience with the growth in industrialization led him to write the novel Looking Backward in 1888, one of the most successful utopian novels. It sold 500,000 copies in the US and was the second best-selling novel of the 19th century, behind only Uncle Tom's Cabin. Even more impressively, it spawned a nationalist movement. The novel and the movement called for the control of the industrial resources and the wealth of the country to be managed by the state without the profit motive. This, of course, would have obliterated the federal system that had proven to nurture explosive economic growth, not only in the US, but in Great Britain before it and China after it, as detailed in Barry Weingas's article, all in favor of centralization. The protagonist of the book wakes up Rip Van Winkle style in the year 2000 in a new world where everyone has what they need and pays for it, with government issued cards, in an economy where trade has been replaced by government distribution systems. As Stephen Jindrisic, historian and president of the Bellamy Memorial Association, stated, "You got a card and everyone was entitled to a fair share of wealth. The world had a union of socialist republics." Perhaps inspired by the currency issues detailed by Milton Friedman in The Crime of 1873, Bellamy has suggested that money itself had been retired as a feature of life in that time. So popular were the ideas that Bellamy clubs sprung up all over the country. There were 165 and 5,000 to 6,000 members in total. Looking Backward was an influence on the New Deal, as well as an inspiration for fellow writer Upton Sinclair's In Poverty in California campaign. Unfortunately, the simplistic nature of the plan presented the usual problems with appeals for government control. The risk, well, one of the many risks, was that this could lead to the scenario described in The Tragedy of the Commons. The theme of egalitarianism was strong in that book and the sequel titled Equality. I also have that book. Additionally, what is most absent from this utopia is a regard for property rights. It's hard to appreciate how these radical ideas, it's hard not to appreciate how these ideas could have influenced the dangerous muddying of constitutionally protected property rights, or at least what were previously protected constitutional rights, as was covered in Takings, Dissent, and Resurrection. You may be more familiar with the work of his cousin Francis, who wrote the Pledge of Allegiance, although his original version involved the pledge looking more like a Nazi salute. Both Bellamy's had links to what was described as an international subversive network connected to the Fabian Socialists. They issued Violent Revolution for incrementalism. The nationalism promoted by the Bellamy's was successful enough to make middle-class Americans actually consider socialism. He would die of tuberculosis at the age of 48 in 1898. He has a public middle school named after him, and his home at 91 Church Street is now his museum and archive. Many of his papers are actually in Harvard. Now, what about the Midwest and the prairie and the little sod houses? As it turns out, one of his neighbors, John Warner, worked as a bookkeeper at the Lamp Knitting Machine Company in Chicopee Falls before leaving to go west to become a farmer. And there's a letter at the Bellamy Museum dated May of 1886 talking about him being in Minnesota in the Dakota region where he had planted 300 acres of wheat, 40 acres of oats, 100 acres of grass, and dealing with some of the weather Dan Bourne wrote about in his book, including hail. His overalls cost him $1.50 and wheat was worth 1.5 cents a pound, probably due to some of that boom bust cycle that was happening in the prairie lands. A year later, he was in Fort Buford. And then by 1889, he was in Alaska. By 1894, he returned to Chicopee Falls and the Lamb Manufacturing Company. Now as a machinist, he got married, contracted typhoid fever, and died in April of 1896. I realize this is starting to sound way too much like the Oregon Trail video game. For all the material progress of the era, both Bellamy and Warner died of communicable diseases that were beyond the development of public health and medical knowledge of the day. Though largely forgotten today, Edward Bellamy played a significant role in the economic and political dialogue of his time and of decades long after him, and he and his neighbors reflected the experience of the time. Thank you, and I look forward to seeing your videos.